My name is John, and let me tell you the story of how I built the first version of my racing tractor at 18 years old. It definitely does get better, but this is the GRÅLLINATOR V1. But what do you say? Let's start at the beginning, shall we? This is before all of the crazy. It looks so innocent, doesn't it? But first is, of course, disassembly. The head was incredibly grimy with heaps of carbon and oil and God knows what. The ports revealed a lot of oil, so the valve guides were definitely leaking. The pistons were also very yucky. But I did make some very interesting finds when taking apart the engine. Here is how the valves should sit, both slightly protruding. This is how I found one of the cylinders. One valve completely flush and one protruding a lot more. So the intake and exhaust valves were put in the wrong place. Here you have the valve retainers and they are at completely different heights. But these old engines have so much room for adjustment, so it still ran great before I took it apart. Wow, my shop really looked sad this long ago. But look at this nifty little adapter thingamajig that I made for a regular F-clamp to take apart the valve train. It works absolutely perfectly and I still use it. I'm not spending money on a spring compressor. Get those keepers out of there. But even when my shop looked like that, I still kept track of everything, except maybe the time where I might have lost a valve keeper on the floor for 2 weeks before I found it again. But in general, my process is still the same. Lots of little baggies that I write on, and then I just need somewhere to place said baggies. Here I made a little clear plate out of some plexiglass with a couple of holes in it to measure the combustion chamber volume, so I could then calculate the static compression ratio. Seal the plate with some grease around the edges, but not too much. You don't want it to build height, you just want it to be flush and sealed. And then you fill it up carefully, tracking the volume that you put into it, so you can then put all the measurements and data into an online calculator. Well, that's if you eat crayons like me. You can calculate it manually, but I think I've used the Summit Racing one actually each time, because it does what I want it to do and nothing else really. So then, after I've done all the measurements and decided how much I'm gonna take off, I give the head a good soak in some diesel for a week or so, and then I went to town with both a dish brush and a toothbrush to make sure it was nice and clean to handle in machining, etc. Speaking of machining, that's what we're doing next. I'm doing this in a regular knee mill, but you gotta make sure the mill head is perfectly square side to side or the mill will make a valley in the middle. Then we come to the actual machining. The ports in this low RPM tractor head were just incredibly, ridiculously small, and there was a huge hump around where the valve guide enters the port. The exhaust ports were too small where the hump was to even get my pinky finger through. Now, that's just absolutely ridiculous. So this head was gonna need some serious porting, which my engine mentor, or whatever you wanna call it, was gonna do. But to make his life a little bit easier, or a lot bit easier when dealing with a cast iron head, I found the biggest end mill I could find in school and just plunged that straight down through the valve seat hole thingy into the port. And yes, I am removing a good chunk of the valve guide, but this is for race purposes, and for race purposes you can do anything you like. No, but in all seriousness, it's not running 8 to 12 hours a day like the tractor would do when it was new from factory in the 50s. It's running for 8 to 12, maybe up to 20 hours a year. So it's not that big of a deal that I get less life out of my valve guides, because I don't care and I'm gonna just gun it either way. If it burns some oil, then it burns some oil. It's not gonna be the end of the world. And now we come to the most interesting part of this whole machining ordeal, and that's milling the head surface to bump up compression a bit. And now keep in mind, this was a low compression tractor engine made for for the really bad fuels in the 50s. So this had a 6:1 compression ratio. Normal cars nowadays have a 8, 9 or even a 10:1 compression ratio. That's a long ways away, and these combustion chambers were super small and super deep, like 20 millimeters deep. So even taking off a good chunk of that head, it still didn't make much of a difference. I took off 5 millimeters off that fucking head, and I still only got from 6:1 to 6.6:1. This is for the final stage. I'm not going to reveal too much, but this is for the next stage of the build, and I'm aiming for 11 or 12:1 compression ratio. So it's a big difference, but I still wanted to shave it. The problem was I was in school. I didn't have a fully stocked, like super fancy engine machine shop. So I didn't have a fly cutter at all, any size. I didn't have a shell mill that was big enough. I didn't have fixturing so I could put it up in the CNC machine, and I did not trust the regular knee mill to be able to do it with any accuracy in multiple passes. So I needed some way to mill the entire wide head surface in one go. So the question was, what do I do then? Because I couldn't go out and buy a fly cutter. I did not have the money for that. So I went digging through all of the cabinets with tools in school, and I found a big boring head. This is a smaller model that I've bought now, several years later, but it's just here as a prop. A boring head is a milling head made for boring up smaller holes to bigger holes, and it can make flat shoulders and all of that good stuff. And you traditionally use a boring bar suited for the boring head, so you can insert it here or wherever you like. But I wanted a big diameter, so I went and got a boring bar from a lathe instead. You can see it's much longer for the same diameter. But when you flip the boring bar, something interesting happens. You get a counterclockwise cutting direction. Now on my mill, that would be no problem, because most mills have the functionality to go clockwise or counterclockwise spindle rotation. But some wise ass teacher, way before my teacher, thought that no, having machining students be able to do actual machining is way too dangerous. So he removed that functionality. He disabled all the counterclockwise switches on all of the mills in the entire school. So I could not do that anymore. So the solution I had was take a boring bar that's not a carbide one like this, but instead with a high-speed steel insert that is square, flip the square insert around and use the boring bar backwards. Which means I had to take really light cuts, as all the cutting forces, instead of going into the boring bar, went into the retaining screw that's just there to hold the insert in place and not to take any cutting forces. So I was there for like a day and a half milling away at this fucking head. But I got there in the end. Look at this. It's very, very slow. I skipped lunch and I stayed afterwards and stuff like that. But I got it done, finally. After all that machining was done, I gave the head to my friend who ported it, and you can just see the amazing difference. Here is the exhaust before porting, and then after porting as well. Now, I'm gonna be honest, when I was assembling these pictures, I almost flipped them around because the exhaust was so much bigger after porting. I thought it was the intake, so he definitely did a job well done. But here is the intake before porting and then after porting. Then with the shaved and ported head, it was of course time for a valve job of the highest caliber. So I put the drill in the vise, chucked up a valve, and firstly with a file and then finishing up with emery cloth, I flattened the sealing face and cleaned them up. Then it was just a matter of grinding the valves in, and this is about 45 minutes worth of grinding in just a couple of seconds. And I might be very biased, but I think it worked perfectly. Might not be how I would do it on a top fuel dragster, but I really don't see how cut seats could be superior. Like really, if both seal, then they're both good as far as I know. Just look at this, it looks perfect to me. And now to be able to rev old Betsy way higher than would be responsible, I of course need stiffer valve springs, because look at this original spring. I can compress it like mostly of the way by hand. And I need like 70, 80, maybe even 90 kilograms or something like that of spring force, and I am not that strong, definitely not. So I guess this also counts as machining, but as the stiffer valve springs that I got have the same outer diameter with thicker wire, they of course have a smaller inner diameter, so I need to turn down the locating diameter on the valve spring retainers. Now they don't need a lot, just a little bit, and I made a small threaded arbor to be able to hold them well in the lathe. A carbide parting tool cut the slightly hardened retainer like butter. Ooh, look at that. I'm still a machinist at heart, and good looking machine parts will never not make me happy. But machining was unfortunately not the only thing this tractor needed, so I also made some other bits. Here is a new little coolant cover for the head I made. It looks okay, but it did not seal because it wasn't stiff enough. So I think I siliconed the gasket on underneath. God. The old dynamo was also toast, so I took the old mount and chopped off a few bits and added this tube spacer so I could fit this alternator of a scrap 90s Volkswagen Golf that I had laying around. Because free. Who doesn't like free? And I'm still using the old pulley which I bored out on the lathe to fit this new shaft because it was slightly bigger. Also, when pulling the tractor apart, the radiator petcock broke when trying to open it, and when I tried to later remove it, the radiator just cracked. So I had a real fun time soldering that together again. Now of course I can't forget about finally getting the grill halves from the previous owner. Now these were painted, but badly painted. I could still see the outline of where the previous paint had chipped off because they just painted over it and didn't like sand it or anything, and that against the patina of the rest of the tractor, yeah, I'm not having that, even on a race tractor. So I dragged them through the gravel outside, and then I buried them for like a week in some dirt and some mud and shit, and then they fit right in. And in proper race spirit, I just attached them with zip ties, and several years later and several races later, they still hold up. So zip ties are not as bad as people think. But now I've only talked about what I've done with all these different components. What do you say we start assembling them and see how they look when they finally come together? All these nice new spiffy parts. And step one is of course putting the valves and the valve springs and the entire valve train into the head. So let's start with that. Oh yeah, it's all coming together very nicely with the new valve springs. But wait, that looks pretty tight between the wires. And now with the reground cam and more lift, how far does it even compress? Oh, it bottoms out before full lift. Fuck! Okay, we can solve this. I'm a machinist, I can solve this. I think it should be fine. So I took it to work after hours and I clamped it down in the machine and measured all the valve locations with a 3D dial gauge and whipped up a quick little program to let the machine do its thing. Super gentle helical toolpath ending in a one flat cleanup pass. No tool loads at all, I'm just trying to get it done while taking absolutely no risk, and that definitely paid off. Now I have the clearance in the valve spring well that I need for the spring to not bottom out. Let's assemble this valve train after all. Assembly lube on the stem, some moly grease on the keepers, but why am I putting moly grease on the valve seat? And both ends of the spring? I cannot tell you even if I wanted to. Can you tell this was filmed over 4 years ago? I can definitely tell. But the finished head looks very spiffy regardless. And somewhere along the way I also changed over from the regular plugs for cast iron heads to plugs for aluminium heads that have longer thread. Now the plug hole wasn't threaded 100% all the way, so I took an old junk long thread plug and filed a groove in it so it could act like a tap. A really good emergency tip for those situations when you don't have a specialty tap. Now I did this both to take up some space in the combustion chamber, but also to bring the spark closer to the center of the combustion chamber. Minimal gains, but absolutely minimal amount of work. So it's a good balance. Next for one of the most exciting parts of the build, but definitely also the most expensive. On V1 at least. So I went from around 6mm lift to 9mm lift at the valve. Just look at that, it's absolutely beautiful. And here we have the finished head with a slight squish clearance ground down also. As the head is flat around the combustion chamber and the piston is also dead flat, the squish here is extreme all the way down to the head gasket thickness. So I just took a grinder to my freshly milled head in order to create a little bit of clearance. Even though I don't think it was enough to make an actual difference, it just felt good. Now we've finally come to assembling it all one last time. I generally cleaned up a lot of parts because the tractor was really grimy. I also blew out the coolant jacket in the block, and boy was there shit in there. All the stuff on the floor plus heaps that went airborne. Now this is when I inspected the block. I noticed something. An old freeze crack that went all the way through the block and had hid behind the intake. Now this was devastating, but as this engine has fully supporting wet sleeves, the sleeve itself has all the strength it needs. The block is basically just there to be a water jacket and keep the sleeves in place, and it still did that job pretty well, except for the keeping the water inside part, because it hadn't leaked before, because I guess it had just rusted shut. But after mounting and dismounting the head, I guess it jostled the head or flexed it or something, because it wasn't completely sealed afterwards, so it started crying out of the crack at the race. So I just had some coolant with me to top it up, and after the race I removed the head again and then ground out the crack just a little bit so I could get down and have something to glue to, because I then filled it with metal epoxy, similar to JB Weld, but it was from my Chinese hardware store, and it's held up for racing for like 4 years now, so I give it my thumbs up. I think it works. Then after everything was clean, the cam and the lifters were in, the head was next. Satisfying! Now the cylinder head is of course incredibly important to torque down properly. Now I didn't have a torque wrench, but that's an easy solution with just some ingenuity. So I needed to torque it down to between 82 and 87 Newton meters of torque. Now a Newton meter is just 1 Newton of force applied 1 meter out from the bolt you're trying to turn. How do we solve this? Well, 10 Newtons is a kilogram of force. So I took a 1 meter long cheetah bar, and then I took one of those like luggage scales or fish scales, and just pulled 8.2 to 8.7 kilograms of force 1 meter out from the bolt, and boom, you have a properly torqued head. And this lasted through races, so it's not something to just write off. Being poor and stupid, you're not gonna have a good time. But being poor and having some ingenuity or some creativity to you, you can get more done than people realize. Now, let's see if she starts, shall we? Den luktar potente. Now me personally, I think this celebration looks so incredibly cringy. It hurts me to watch it. But at the same time, I feel it's very powerful because it's definitely as genuine as they come. Because this was a project over 2 years in the making, and the first big accomplishment that I've ever made in my life. Sure, I'd built things before, but this was the first big project I actually accomplished. And the first actual like proper dream come true for me. So it's a really big deal for me, and I'm really happy about it, and I'm really proud of it. Now, I'm not gonna talk very much more. I thank you so much for watching, and I urge you to hit the like button if you want to see more of the GRÅLLINATOR, the projects and everything like that, so I know to keep making more. I'm gonna shut up and leave you with a compilation of race videos and general hooning. Rest in peace, Ken.